Let's talk about JavaScript closures with examples. When discussing closures in JavaScript, it's essential to think about two nested functions, the outer function and the inner function. Closures comes to play only on nested functions. The key feature of closures is the inner function's ability to remember the variables defined in the outer function, even after the outer function has completed its execution. So in simple terms, a closure is a function that can remember its environment. This means that the inner function retains access to the outer function's variable, allowing it to use them even when the outer function is no longer running. In JavaScript, you can think of a closure as a function that remembers. More simply, it refers to a function that can access variables from its containing function or else the outer function even after that outer function has finished its execution. So let's start with some of the examples. First example is data encapsulation and privacy. Let's have a look how we can achieve data encapsulation and privacy using closures. In JavaScript, we don't have private variables built in. In some languages such as Java, we have private methods and private variables. But to achieve these private variables behavior, data encapsulation and privacy, we can use the power of closures. And let's see how we can achieve that. Let's have a look at this example. In here we have defined a function called createCounter. And what happened here is when we call this createCounter, the outer function gets triggered and it gets finished. And when we use counter.increment, you can see these inner functions here. All these inner functions has access to this count variable. So only way to access this count variable is through these inner functions. So you can't directly call count variable outside from this function. So that's how we can use closures to use the data encapsulation and privacy. In line 20, we execute createCounter function, and we can use this counter variable to access these inner functions. Since this createCounter returns three functions called increment, decrement, and getCount. You can see when we call counter.increment, it executes this function, and inside this increment function, it has access to this count variable which was defined in line number 3. If you can remember, this variable was already defined when we execute this createCounter in line 20, and that function has finished its execution. But still these functions increment, decrement, and getCount has access to this variable which was defined in the outer function. So that's where the closures comes into play. So closures, as I said, it's a function that can remember. So if we go one by one, in line 20 we createCounter function got executed, and in next line we increment it by 1, which trigger console logs 1 here. Then we increment it again using count.increment, then it increments it again, and in the third line we increment it again. So 3 is console logged, and finally we execute getCount, which has the access to the latest count variable which was incremented 3 times, and it console log number 3. So that's how we can use closures to get data encapsulation and privacy.